Now on Radio 4, in the second part of Intelligence, Born Smart, Born Equal, Born Different, Adam Rutherford explores the post-war period when scientific studies of intelligence focused on nurture, not our nature.
We are not born equal for all sorts of reasons. Class, wealth, geography, who you know, and yes, genetics all contribute to birth inequity. This raises an interesting question.
Are all differences among individuals in educational outcome, social class, wealth, income, due to differences in treatment and opportunity? Or in a perfectly fair society, would you still expect people to differ in their life outcomes because of inborn differences in either talent or temperament or both?
Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker. Or, put another way,
why am I the first Kinnick in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university? Why is Glenys the first woman in her family in 1,000 generations to be able to get to university? Was it because all our predecessors were thick, not university material? Couldn't they have knocked off all their A-levels in an afternoon?
Neil Kinnock speaking at the Welsh Labour Party conference in 1987. Without the right opportunities, there was little chance of the children of Welsh miners getting to university. Right from the start, the environment we're brought up in has a huge impact on our academic achievement. Even if the most expensive education doesn't always work.
Sorry, you are? Tim Nice but Dim. Great friends with Dick Friendly but Thick.
Must have been before my time.
73 to 77. Then retake 78 to 84. Great friends with peers, nothing between the ears.
Yeah. What's he done since leaving?
He's grown a moustache, sir.
Harry Enfield's posh thicko, Tim Nice but Dim. Nonetheless, higher than average socio-economic status does go hand in hand with higher than average academic achievement, regardless of genetic makeup. In the first part of this series on the inheritance of intelligence, we learnt that however you measure it, and yes, I know there are no perfect measures, that intelligence is around 50% heritable. This, of course, leaves plenty of scope for other influences, class, ambition, money, and it's the study of these social factors that I'll be exploring today. Anna Vignoles is a professor of education at Cambridge University.
We've known for a long time that a child's family background has a huge influence on their outcomes. There's no doubt about that. We know that mother's education, father's education has a big influence on the child's own achievement. We also know that parental literacy makes a great deal of difference to children's own literacy, for example. We know that simply being poor is a risk for the child in terms of their long-term outcomes.
We know that good nutrition, better schools, wealth, and a whole host of other factors influence academic performance. These environmental factors do make a huge difference.
It might not be causal, but knowing something about the parents' income, something about their own level of education, something about how many books they have in the house, all this is highly informative about which children are going to be at risk of poor achievement.
One of the best predictors of reading in the early school years is number of books in the home.
Professor Robert Ploman from King's College London.
Just because you can measure that number of books on the shelves.
So not even whether you read them or not, the correlation is with how many metres of shelves
you also, how much parents read to their kids, but you have to take their word for it. It's an objective indicator, and it correlates with how much parents read to the kids. That was interpreted purely environmentally. And I hope you can realize there's another hypothesis. If the books didn't get on the shelves by themselves, the parents like to read, and they probably like to read to the children. It drives me mad reading the newspaper. All these correlations that get interpreted as if they're causal environmentally. And I'm always saying, it could be genetic.
How much of our brain power is nature and how much is nurture? The debate rages on. Over the past 100 years, the focus of scientific interest in intelligence has swung from one extreme to the other. From the idea that some people are just born smart to the notion that IQ scores are simply a measure of your socio-economic status. Jill Boucher is Professor of Psychology at City University in London.
Within my own discipline, I've watched the pendulum swing. I have observed to my, I think distress is hardly too strong a word, how I don't know whether it's a particularly Western culture thing or a British thing. You see it in our politics, you see it in our judicial system. Very adversarial. It's either this or it's that.
At the end of the Victorian age, I think it's fair to say that there was a distinct lack of enthusiasm for the kind of social mobility that Neil Kinnock would later dream of. And there was a great deal of interest in the inheritance of intelligence. In the years following the Second World War, all of this changed. Suddenly, there was a strong desire for social equality, and with it a sense that we are all born equal, that we were brothers in arms. In this new culture, the idea that some people were born smarter than others was deeply out of fashion, and the scientists who studied the genetics of intelligence fell far from grace.
There are scientists who have been compared to Nazis, who've been called racists, whose lectures have been picketed and interrupted, some of whom have been physically assaulted.
Strong stuff for mild-mannered scientists. But it was a desire for improving society that drove this hostility. Professor of Education, Michael Rice.
If one now, in the 21st century, looks back on England in the 20th century with an incredibly broad brush, one can see that after the horrors of the Second World War, there was obviously a complete revulsion against the thought of eugenics. And to some extent, optimism, 1950s, this transformed itself into an enthusiastic idea that everybody would be healthy, all children would have the right sort of education. There's a lot in that I value hugely and indeed benefited from myself.
In the wake of Nazism, there was a revulsion to anything genetic, partly because it would seem to stigmatize certain groups that were deemed genetically inferior on the basis of pseudoscience, of course. There's no serious psychologist or biologist would say that any human group is genetically inferior. But nonetheless, that taint persisted. And also out of a concern that any kind of acknowledgement of human nature is somehow reactionary or fatalistic, that if we're not just products of our environment, then that puts limits on how good a society we can hope to attain. Both of which I think are mistakes, but those were the components of the post-World War II ideology that I think has shaped this understanding.
A view which continues among many social scientists to this day.
The way I would look at it is if I had a choice to research something that was amenable to social policy, such as the impact of good nutrition on children's achievement or the impact of, good preschool on children's achievement, I might be inclined to want to research that because it's likely to really genuinely impact on the outcomes for poor kids and genuinely improve social mobility. That doesn't mean to say that we don't want to know the role of genetics in determining something specific like intelligence, but I just think that it's very easy for that to slip into a justification for a lack of action and a justification as to why we can't improve social mobility, and that is, in my view, not the case.
Our post-war desire for social mobility and equality of opportunity pushed the focus of intelligence research from the biological to the social sciences. We were motivated to study things that could be altered, rather than our genetic inheritance, which is fixed. Progress through better healthcare, better housing, better schooling for all, rather than the early 20th century ideas from Francis Galton and others of social engineering via that toxic idea of eugenics. Pre-war studies of the inheritance of intelligence gave way to post-war psychology.
And there was this happy thought of the behaviourists that if you could adjust the environment, you could more or less achieve anything for any individual. And this was powerful stuff, and of course there was a great deal of truth in what the behaviourists were saying, a huge amount. We must not underestimate the role of environmental factors.
Indeed. But does that justify this? Moral philosopher Peter Singer.
What we saw in the 70s was that some scientists who proposed a significant role for genes were actually, held down when they tried to give talks, particularly, of course, when they suggested some link with differences between races and intelligence. That was, I guess, the particularly incendiary point. And that's probably still extremely sensitive.
Going back to the middle of the century, for example, Arthur Jensen linked genes to intelligence and to race, which was obviously highly controversial and refuted by the overwhelming majority of social scientists.
Professor Robert Ploman from King's College London has been studying the genetics of intelligence for decades. He recalls the hostility from prominent psychologists at the beginning of his career in the US.
It was incredibly tough. I was a graduate student in the early 70s, and I was at my first professional meeting. It was the Eastern Psychological Association, several thousand people there, and Leon Kamen, who was completely anti-genetics, gave a rabble-rousing speech that had people on their feet, and it was like the beginning of a witch hunt, saying there are these people who are interested in genetics and psychology, and we have to root them out, and it was an amazing thing.
It's astonishing that scientists should be capable of saying things.
That's what I thought. But I was just a babe in the woods then, and I was going to a science meeting, and here it was, this rabble-rousing ad hominem political speech. Just assuming that if you study genetics, if you're interested in genetics, you've got to be something close to a Nazi.
Studies of intelligence do trouble a lot of people, and I think one reason is that if intelligence is influenced by our genes, that suggests that we don't all have an equal opportunity to achieve in the same way. For example, to get into universities or to get into excellent universities. Even if, and more, it suggests that we can't really change that just by saying, well, we need to give people better opportunities. We need to make sure that primary schooling is equally good in different parts of the country, or we need to give them preschooling. We need to make sure that their parents stimulate them or do the kinds of things that will develop their potential fully. If genes are playing a significant role, then no matter what we do, we're not going to get a level playing field, because the playing field starts already uneven. And I think that's really what troubles most people.
With intelligence, there was a very influential paper in 1963 in Science, bringing the previous 80 years' worth of research together, saying, looks to me like there's a strong genetic component to individual differences in intelligence. Things started swinging back a bit, towards nature, from a point where it was totally nurture. You couldn't talk about genetics. And then, 1969, Arthur Jensen's thing came out in the Harvard Educational Review talking about how much can we change children's educational achievement, and it mentioned race as well, and that put the brakes on.
I'm trying to work out why psychology in that era, in the 70s, was so reticent about what I consider to be just straight, it's almost biochemistry.
Yeah, but I think that may be the point. People went into psychology, they say, I want to study psychology, I don't want to study biology.
And never the twain shall meet. I'm a geneticist, but I'm the son of a psychologist. Sorry about this, Dad.
Nowadays, the social sciences have a very good relationship with the natural sciences by and large, and it's a two-way process of dialogue and discovery. But to be bluntly honest, a lot of social scientists in the sort of 60s and 70s were not exactly very strong on population genetics and biology in general. And when one reads some of the objections in the 1970s to research on genetics of intelligence, written by leading social scientists, some of it is pretty uninformed, just as, I would argue, some of the writing by natural scientists on how we should change society was pretty naive and uninformed.
And so, the idea that it was either nature or nurture persisted. And again, this time in the 1990s, a giant cat was set amongst the pigeons. Political scientist Charles Murray and psychologist Richard Herrnstein published The Bell Curve, subtitle Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. The fallout? Widespread outrage.
Their point was that there would be limits to what we could do in terms of social policy, in terms of, being able to improve the lot of poor children, simply because a high proportion of intelligence would be or is inherited. Again, their views were refuted, I would say, by the majority of social scientists. So certainly a topic that was highly controversial, and I would say the vast majority of social scientists during this period didn't see the genetic determinants of intelligence as something that was a legitimate finding in the literature.
One of the most famous responses to the bell curve came from Arthur Goldberger and Charles Mansky. They argued not that the heritability of intelligence was wrong, but that studying it was all a bit pointless.
The The point they were making is not that intelligence wasn't partially hereditary, but that it was not a useful thing to know when it came to thinking about social policy. There's a wonderful analogy, for example, used by Goldberger, and he uses the analogy of eyeglasses. And he asks whether knowing that poor eyesight is largely or entirely inherited, would knowing that help us design good social policy? How would it help us to, decide how to fund opticians or to design better eyeglasses? How would it help us decide how we make sure that the poor get eyeglasses? How would it help us decide whether we invest in technologies to help those with poor eyesight? The answer, of course, is that it wouldn't. Knowing that the condition is inherited is pretty much irrelevant to all that. And so I suppose their point was, even if a significant proportion of intelligence is inherited, that doesn't really help us with the most pressing policy issue that we have, which is how do we help the poorest children in our society from the most impoverished homes progress better in school and do well in the labour market.
The bell curve didn't chime with the notion that if we put our mind to it, we can achieve anything. In the second half of the 20th century, to focus on our nature was to crush the dream of social mobility. And so the scientific emphasis in studies of intelligence shifted towards the nurture side of the equation. Twins are the weapon of choice for studies on intelligence. Identical twins have identical DNA, so any difference between twins will be environmental. On rare occasions, twins are separated at birth, which means that they don't even have a shared upbringing. Jill Boucher and first Robert Plomin.
An amazing set of data are adoption studies, where you take children adopted away at birth from their biological parent, raised by adoptive parents from the first few weeks of life.
Because what you really want to know is when perhaps two identical twins have been separated from very early infancy and brought up in perhaps two rather contrasting environments, to what extent are the, what I would call, developmental outcomes the same, and to what extent they're different.
The adoption studies, just like the twin studies, have found a significant role for genetics, in the sense that the similarity between a child's parents and the child themselves, biological parents, was greater in terms of IQ than the similarity between the adopted parents and the child's own IQ. And that's sort of corroborating what we see in twin studies.
I did an adoption study, one of the largest adoption studies, and we find that early on, the adopted away children don't correlate much with their parents' IQ. But that correlation goes up and up and up until by 16 years of age, the adoptive children correlate as much with their birth parents' IQ, intelligence, even though they've never seen that parent after the first 3 days of life.
So does it all swing back towards genetics again?
A lot of it's not genetics still, but the point of this is that the adoptive parents' correlation is near zero all the way along, suggesting that growing up in the same family with a higher IQ parent who has those books and cultural opportunities isn't doing it for you. The environment's important, but it's not the environment that we've always assumed was important. Conveyed by the word nurture, it's the idea of what the family provides. And these data suggest that's not where the environmental action is.
So many of the problems that we have in this discussion at a public level, at a societal level, is to do with, it seems to me, it's to do with the language. That we don't quite have the right words to describe these very complex scientific ideas. So we say things like nurture, which automatically feels like a warm, fuzzy, the way how much your parents cuddled you and read to you, right? But that's not what it means in a scientific sense.
No. It's about the environment, which, as we've said, is everything other than inherited DNA sequence.
So, nature and nurture, cute words that almost rhyme, but actually are deeply unhelpful in understanding humans. If nature is DNA, nurture is everything else. Everything. Robert Plomin.
In genetics, we're very narrowly defining genetic to mean DNA sequence variation that you inherit from your parents. Genetic is defined very narrowly, and environment is defined incredibly broadly to mean everything else. So that includes DNA events that aren't inherited, includes illnesses, biology, prenatal factors. Everything else is called environment. It should more precisely be called non-genetic.
I see. So I think often people think about environment and they're actually thinking about the space that we're in. But actually, there's a whole load of environment which is even within the cells and our bodies, which is not genetic. It's an environmental thing.
Yeah. Nurture sometimes is defined too much to mean family upbringing. So it is important to recognize that if we put DNA on the table, it doesn't do anything. It has to be in an environment to do its thing.
I think it's very easy for people, certainly in the intelligence debate, to think that the environment comes in when the child goes to school. But no. And then maybe, perhaps more sophisticated, think, well, it's in toddlerhood and with, parental interaction with the child and kind of environment the child is brought up in. And I would say even earlier, it's from conception. What happens in utero, what is the developing fetus exposed to in utero, because this will also affect what the baby is born with.
The first thing that could be considered nurture, not nature, is the entry point of your father's sperm into your mother's egg. That helps determine the orientation of you as you develop from conception onwards. When scientists started thinking about nurture, the environmental cues that shape our behaviour, they focused on the things we hope to control and even alter. Parenting, teaching, books, love, things that we hope to change to build a fairer world. They are all terribly important, but they're only part of a suite of influences which start acting right at the very beginning when you were conceived. Steven Pinker.
If you look at the correlation in intelligence, personality, life outcomes, almost anything you want to measure in identical twins reared together, not the exotic cases of twins separated at birth, but just, any pair of twins that you know, they correlate pretty highly, much more highly than two people picked off the street at random, and even more highly than ordinary siblings. But they don't correlate perfectly, nowhere near perfectly. The correlation is often in the ballpark of 0.5, 50%. So where does that other 50% come from? It can't come from the parents, because they got the same parents. Can't come from the schools. They go to the same schools, most of them. They can't come from older siblings, younger siblings, how many televisions are in the house, how many books are in the house. Where does it come from? As far as I can tell, there are only two possibilities standing. One of them is random statistical effects in the physical development of the brain and body, and the other is random life events that somehow leave a lasting impact. So if one twin was chased by a dog one day and the other twin wasn't, or one twin got the top bunk bed, the other got the bottom bunk bed, and if those leave lasting effects, capricious events that have surprisingly large effects, those are the only two hypotheses that can explain why identical twins are so different.
Random events in the womb and random events in life. Two factors that are neither genetic nor things we can control. Chance. It's not something us scientists are very keen on.
As a scientist, you don't like to jump to chance. It's sort of the last resort, isn't it? When you try to explain things systematically as best you can. But after 20 years' work in terms of trying to find these non-shared environments, using identical twins who differ, because the differences within identical twins can only be due to these factors, because they're genetically identical. Any differences has to be due to these non-shared environmental factors. But it looks like most of the environmental influences work just in that way, in this sort of random, we call it non-shared way. Whatever it is, it's not making two kids, even identical twins, growing up in the same family, attending the same class. It makes them different, not similar. So that's a very important finding as well.
The harder we look, the more the environment becomes uncontrollable. And way earlier than the classroom, toddlerhood, or even birth, the randomness of a life also has a profound effect on what makes us different, even identical twins. The more we refine what we mean by nurture, as opposed to our genetic nature, the more it's clear that the environmental influences on intelligence are not solely what we initially imagined. The home environment and classroom are terribly important, but so too are conditions in the womb. Just over 10 years ago, Steven Pinker's book The Blank Slate caused an almighty stink. He argued forcefully that post-war scientists had denied the role of genetics in the study of human behaviour, including our intelligence. And as a result, the impact of our upbringing had been greatly exaggerated.
I thought there was an unexamined assumption that not only the human mind is a blank slate, that is, we have no inherited talents or temperaments and are just a product of socialization and parenting, but there was also a mistaken idea that this was a politically more palatable scientific position to hold. That is, whether or not it's true, let's hope it's true that the mind is a blank slate, because that would lead to more humane and progressive policies. And I think that that is a moral and political error piled on top of the scientific error.
And how was it received? What sort of feedback did you get at the time and to this day?
Controversial would be an understatement. It was the target of some withering attacks in magazines and newspapers, but also a great deal of support and praise.
Those attacks, what sort of things did they say? What were they focusing on?
Most of the attacks actually focused on parts that I thought were the most innocuous. The claim that parents have very little influence over the formation of intelligence and personality in their children was one that many people attacked and few people understood.
Looking back over the second half of the 20th century, you could be forgiven for thinking genetics was largely irrelevant in determining intelligence. Scientists who studied this area were not to be trusted. Social scientists reigned supreme, and the environment became king, in the hope that we could change it to craft a better world. So, have we?
Actually, despite decades of policy, social mobility has remained remarkably stuck, and people have started to ask why. And obviously one possible explanation is that you're trying to work against, if you like, the problem of inherited genes. I personally would refute that explanation. I think it's not the right question when we're thinking about social policy, but I think it does explain why social scientists have become more interested in genes in recent years.
In the wake of the blank slate, there has been a resurgence of interest in the genetics of intelligence, with scientists such as Robert Plomin reminding us that the environment isn't everything.
I do think the pendulum has swung from the days of Galton, where they emphasized nature, to the 30s with the horrors of Nazi Germany and behaviorism, which believed you are what you learn. It's all environmental. And the pendulum has now, I think, swung back, I hope, in the middle, because that's what the data say. You can do a lot environmentally, but to ignore the genetic differences between children seems to me to be making a mistake for parents, for teachers, for the educational system, for society.
Over its murky 100-year history, we've seen the science of intelligence swing from genetics, sometimes as eugenics, to the dream of a levelled playing field for all in the post-war era. In the 21st century, perhaps we've finally settled somewhere in the middle. In the final part of this series, I'll be questioning if we're ready to start thinking about intelligence with a mature view that brings both nature and nurture together. And I'll be asking a very simple question. What does this all mean for education?
Intelligence, Born Smart, Born Equal, Born Different was presented by Adam Rutherford. The producer was Anna Buckley.